everyone. Welcome to the September edition of the Cloud Native Brisbane Meetup. A very warm welcome to people who joined us online as well as people who joined us in person at Brisbane. It's nice to see the community growing. We've had a real rapid growth in number of folks joining our meetup. We have gone up to 140 people on the meetup group, and we've had some pretty good participation in our meetup sessions. And as part of that, we've also changed the way you join this meetup. Rather than an open Zoom link, we right now are requiring participants to register into a webinar format. This allows us to send the Zoom link directly to the email at which you've registered. So please bear with us while we go through this transition. This is to ensure a better meetup experience for folks who are joining in. And as always, please be aware of the code of conduct. We as a meetup group are dedicated to provide a harassment-free meetup experience to everyone. The code of conduct is very simple. Be kind to each other and behave professionally. With that, today's session is being presented by David Kari. David is the head of solution engineering for VMware. David has years of experience in helping customers build cloud-native experiences. David is going to be talking about Backstage, and he's going to be talking to us about building developer portals and making sure that there is great developer experience. And he's going to be talking to us about how Spotify used Backstage to do something very similar and how Spotify contributed Backstage to the open source community. With that, handing it over to David. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Pradeep, and thank you for having me in this session. So, yes, I need to share my screen. I just realized. So let me just share first and foremost. Confirm everything's good. Okay, yes, so today I'm going to go through a little bit of a story around how Spotify worked on a particular project to speed up the process that development teams had in terms of delivering software to production. So before I get started, I should probably tell you a little bit about myself and my journey. I am actually at heart a software developer. I started with a company called Dow Jones Telerate, which is actually like an organization that provides stock feeds or stock exchange feeds, option feeds to organizations. It was then acquired by a company called Bridge. I then started working for a startup, which was a precursor to eBay, actually. So that probably tells you a little bit about how old I am. It was called ubid.com. I think ubid.com still exists in the US, so that's there. I then went and worked in a software consulting business called Symbiont. Worked on many organizations, websites, their journeys in terms of developing custom software in their environments, predominantly in the Microsoft stack. And then about 9 years ago, I joined an organization called Pivotal. And I was exposed to something which sort of changed my view of how I actually delivered software into whatever environment, whether it's production, whether it's tests, doesn't matter. And that was really different to the way that I'd experienced before. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go along. Pivotal was acquired over 2.5 years ago by VMware, and I'm now part of the Tanzu team. And I look after, as Pradeep mentioned, the solution engineering in Australia and New Zealand, but I've also got another team that sort of looks after application platform architecture across APJ. And it's a really interesting space to be working in, which is really about how you streamline that path to production. So that's a little bit about me. But before I get any further, I want to ask a question of everyone that's online in the room with us. And so the question is, I'd like to know what role best describes the work that you do. So that for those of you that can see the poll, please respond. Those that are in the room, just send it in the chat, let us know, whatever it is, just tell us what it is. So yeah, option: software engineer, platform engineer, infrastructure engineer, a product manager, or other. I don't actually know what the other would be, but let's go with that.
So it looks like we have a lot more software engineers, and we have a few platform engineers and infrastructure engineers too.
Oh, nice. So a lot of software engineers. Excellent. You know what? That's great. So hopefully this makes it really interesting. And in terms of like what we're going to go through. So before I sort of get into Spotify, it's probably worthwhile talking about what are the sort of modern application challenges? As I said, my background is software development, and I remember actually trying to get code into whatever that environment was, whether it was production or development, staging, pre-prod, whatever it was. And there was always this challenge of like, you know, how did my code actually run in a different environment from the one that I was developing in? What did that look like, right? And it was always like, I'd give my code to someone else, typically an operations team, and there would be all of these issues that would arise. And then I'd start digging in, and I'd find that there were issues on the environment. It didn't have certain app dependencies. It may not have had certain configuration that was required, whatever it was. It would create problems. And then I'd promote from that environment to another environment, and I'd encounter different issues again. And so that was a real issue. But the modern app challenges, so in some ways are similar, but they also, you know, have evolved as more and more development teams have been building modern applications. And if I classify these in sort of the, you know, the ops, security area and dev area, the types of things that you're hearing, and there's some studies out there, you know, in terms of various locations. There's links in this deck, and I'm sure that the deck will be provided to other people. So, you know, in terms of using something like Kubernetes, and I'm hoping everyone has sort of come across that in terms of how you sort of manage and orchestrate workloads of a specific type. You know, if we look at the number of organizations and sort of people using it, there's a very large percentage. And so some of the things that operations teams are finding is that they've got a lack of visibility of like what those you know, who's got access, how it's actually used, you know, who's doing what. Where are the clusters? Where are the clouds? Like, what does this look like, right? And sort of, you know, it's a really interesting. What does data protection look like? You know, for the ops teams, that's a really big thing. They're really interested in this stuff. So from a security perspective, some of the things that we've seen recently, Log4j, you know, various other vulnerabilities that have come up, like these sorts of vulnerabilities that occur, they can really impact an organization. You know, how do you then, you know, sort of ensure that you're not, you know, compromised, and how does security and the security requirements, you know, make sure that they're being embedded in the process to deploy software and in those environments. And then from the developer's perspective, it's like, how am I modernizing these enterprise apps? Like, let's take a legacy or heritage app, I should call, and how am I streamlining that path into production? How do I avoid the challenge that I had when I was deploying something from one environment, promoting to another, and then finding all of this configuration drift and all of these issues that might. And then, you know, the big one, Kubernetes is somewhat complicated. Like, I'll be honest about it. There is a lot of stuff in Kubernetes. There are a lot of, you know, resources, a lot of different components. And so it's complicated. And then the learning curve is really important. And as a developer, is that really what I want to spend my time on? It might be. It might be, and it's super interesting, and I find it super interesting. But if I'm writing software which is driving business value, that's really where I want to focus my time and effort. So these are kind of some of the modern app challenges. It's not made easier by what we see in the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, by the way. If you look at, and this was a snapshot I took recently of like various projects that exist across application frameworks and orchestration and management tools and runtime and provisioning, there is a lot of stuff out there. There is a lot of stuff out there. Choosing which particular tool is the one to use for the need that you have, it can get complicated, and goes back to that learning curve thing. There is a lot of stuff out there, and it keeps growing. If you took a snapshot of this a year ago, you would see less. If you took 2 years ago, less. And so on and so forth. It keeps growing. It's not something that is actually, the one thing that I do note about this is they actually have categorized things into platform and runtime, but the actual tiles that you see and the technologies that you see, there is a lot of stuff there. And if you're squinting to look at them, guess what? The reason is because there's so much. So have a look at the Cloud Native Compute Foundation. This is the number of projects that exist out there. So super complicated. Great from an engineering perspective. I'm going to ask my second poll question, or question to the audience as well. And I'm really interested in this because this sort of goes to the story around how you can sort of increase velocity or increase productivity. So the question is, in your organizations, or how long before a new engineer in your a new engineer can deploy into production in your organization. So the organizations that you work in. And so it would be interesting to see what the results of that are. So within 1 week, A, 2 to 3 weeks, B, and more than 3 weeks, C. So
a lot of more than 3 weeks and a few 2 to 3 weeks.
Okay, awesome. Not awesome, because I'm sure everyone is looking to try and do things a lot quicker. Or let me change that, because that's not necessarily the case. A lot of people want the capability to be able to do things quicker, which is different to having to do it quicker. It's the ability to be able to do it quicker. And that's kind of the important point. And I guess this is kind of like where a question came up, and it's something that came out of Spotify as well. And this was a question they asked themselves: how many days between joining their company, their organization, their business unit, whatever it was, would it take them to make their first 10 pull requests? So forget about, I guess, production for a second. This is just in the source repos. You know, how quickly can you do the first 10, right? And it was like this formed the basis of this new test that they set themselves. If we can get this, and by the way, the answers that a lot of you gave in terms of like that greater than 3 weeks, it's somewhat similar to a lot of organizations. They all have this very similar outcome, you know, 30, 40, 50 days before they're able to do that first 10 pull requests. So before I talk about Spotify, I'm always interested in what music platforms people listen to. Now, there's a few out there. One, Spotify. B, Apple Music. Apple Music seems to be popular. SoundCloud. Other. I don't know what the others would be. And who doesn't listen to any, by the way? Spotify is the winner.
Yeah, Spotify is the winner.
Oh, really? There you go. That would fall in the other category. There you go. So Spotify, overwhelmingly, you know, a lot of people are across it, right? So I personally listen to Spotify and then some SoundCloud, although they're different, right? SoundCloud is more for creators rather than being the distribution sort of like mechanism. But I know Spotify is sort of moving into that space as well. So let's talk about a bit of history about Spotify, because this is what this is all about, and their journey, right? One of the things that you realize, by the way, I didn't work at Spotify, as you saw from my journey, but I know a little bit about them, doing a bit of research and looking at some of the talks that they've done at various events. They had a large number of tools within Spotify as they existed, as they grew, right? And there's a lot of systems, a lot of documentation, and a lot of that actually slowed down the way they worked, right? So, and so that impacted a lot of their engineering capacity. So let's kind of dive into that a little bit more. They started around the mid 2000s. I think it was around 2007 when they incorporated. I'm happy for someone to clarify, to check me on that one. But they sort of started really growing traction around the 2008. Around 2008, they started to get some subscriptions happening. And then what you noticed with them is they started to like really ramp up as they started to get out in the market, and more people started to talk about Spotify, and they started to advertise. You know, you start to see this really, really sort of, I guess, somewhat exponential, maybe linear / exponential growth that they encountered. And what they were doing, though, at the same time, was that their technology was growing. Right? They were starting to release more things. More engineering teams were coming on. I mentioned that, you know, the number of tools and documentation that existed. Their ecosystem became a really big issue for them as they were growing. And the issue that became really, really big for them is, as new engineers came in, as new teams were spun up to provide more, as you can imagine, they're going through this upswing of subscriptions. They're trying to add new features, but it's becoming harder because their ecosystem is growing. And that's not what they want, because effectively what that does is it slows them down, right? And so they want to do something about that. And it was very important to them to do something about that, right? So you remember that slide I showed you, which had the CNCF, all of those tools. Imagine going to Spotify, new development team spun up, and then hang on, which tool am I supposed to use? And then, which cloud should I use? They use cloud. You know, Spotify uses the cloud. Which cloud should I use? What console am I supposed to use? How do I get my head around? All of these things slowed them down. So as they grew, they were slowing down. And if you're Spotify, born in the cloud organization, and you've got this massive growth in subscription, you don't want to be going slow. You want to be going very, very fast, right? You want to be adding features. Otherwise, the likes of Amazon Music and Apple Music are going to sort of like really, start to eat into your market. And that's not what they wanted. So what did they do? Now, Spotify had a platform team. And it's very important. This is really important because I actually talk to a lot of customers about the importance of a platform team, and that platform team going out to their customers, being the internal customers in terms of what they need, right? And this platform team, which is actually quite small, about 4 or 5 people in the platform team at Spotify, I think, and it still remains fairly small. They went out and they surveyed and they asked questions of the people that are, using their platforms. They had various platforms, right? They had various things that they were looking at. And so they started to survey them. And then some of the feedback that came out, some of these things were statements that came out, and some of these were, questions, right? So some things that came back from the audience they were surveying. It's way too complex. There's way too much choice. It's very, very complicated. We don't know if we should be using this cloud. We don't know if we should be using that particular service. They didn't know, and that slowed them down. So that test that we mentioned before, how quickly can you do those first 10 pull requests? Well, they weren't doing that very well. Okay, so that's an issue. There's a lot of context switching, right? Oh, I'm going to use the cloud console for this particular hyperscaler, and then I've got to go over to use a service that sits over here. It's a lot of context switching. And if you work in application development, I suppose if you work anywhere, context switching slows you down, right? So you don't want to do that. You want to try and avoid that. Then there was the question of which tool is the right tool, because this was a question rather than a statement. It's like, should I be using this or should I be using that? It's because of this complexity and the context switching. It's like questions. Should I use that tool? Should I use this particular data service or that messaging service? I don't know what to do here. And then the other thing that was really, really big in Spotify as well is, you can imagine a fairly large ecosystem of different services or APIs that they were building, because they were an API sort of driven company. But what was already out there? What APIs are out there? A new developer comes along, you know what, I'll create a new API. But hang on, there's already an API out there that does what I need it to do. So maybe I should be using that. So that was also an issue. And so discoverability, being able to view and see the APIs that existed was a big thing. And then a really big one, which I know every developer loves, is documentation. Where is the documentation, right? Like, where's the documentation for these APIs, these services, these whatever they are, right? And that was a really big one. These were some of the main statements that were made by the feedback, and also some of the questions that were asked. But there was a lot more, right? There was other things that came out of it. So this platform team, which had kind of like worked on this platform, which basically started off as virtual machines, and then it moved into the container world and orchestration of that. They got this feedback and they started to think, well, we need to do something about this. And so what did they do? They actually looked at, and it wasn't one ring to rule them all, okay? But it was like one ring to rule them all. They looked at a single platform that developers could use, a single portal that developers could use to address a lot of the issues that they were getting as feedback. Again, I very much implore anyone that works in a platform engineering team to go and seek that feedback from the people that need to use your platforms. And so some of the things that they were looking to develop or provide as part of this platform, and they called it Backstage, this is the logo for Backstage, is a single sort of like interface, some standardization in terms of like, how teams are able to actually, create projects, create products. We should call them products because that's the way we did this. How they actually deploy those products, abstract away a little bit of like the back end in terms of like the platform that their software products end up in. Remove all of these different infrastructure teams that might exist, so that they sort of like all just have a single method in terms of getting there. Integrate all the different tools by creating this concept of plugins, and Backstage is a pluggable architecture effectively. Remove a lot of the fragmentation and hopefully the complexity that exists. But still make it extendable. So still make this something that could be added to. if you wanted it to be, and so if you wanted to add services, if other engineering teams wanted to, create a method for a particular team to deploy their software, they could do that. And so that's part of their philosophy. The other thing that they did is they realized, after talking to a number of other organizations, because they were out there talking at various conferences, this was a problem that didn't just exist at Spotify, it existed everywhere. And so they open sourced it to try and get more and more organizations involved in building out Backstage. And effectively, Backstage changed the way Spotify worked. It really sped up their whole process in terms of being able to deliver software service to end customer. And I guess made life a lot easier for the development teams, engineering teams that are looking to do that, which is really, really, I guess, the thing that they were aiming for. So why don't we have a quick look at Backstage? So it's a CNCF project, accepted. It's an open platform for developer experience, effectively a developer experience, but it's a lot more than developer experience in terms of what it provides. But I'll sort of focus more on that dev side of things. So a few things that sort of come to the fore, and I will show you a version of Backstage. I'll get back to that. Application starters, this concept of like development teams being able to get in and start really quickly, avoiding that, that cognitive thing of like, what should I pick? What should I use? It's just like application starters. I need to create a .NET project, or I need to create a Node or a Golang, piece of software, very, very simply, right? The ability to bootstrap any of those starters, so the whole process in terms of like being able to sort of like not just create it, but also then send it, build the image, scan, so on and so forth, the whole project. Ease of management of your pipeline in terms of being able to like, take your software from code all the way through to whatever environment you're sending it to, which would be Kubernetes, some sort of Kubernetes deployment somewhere. Having security embedded as part of that. And then one of the other things was that remove that complexity of being able to discover APIs. Like, how easy is it for me to find an API, like, or register an API for others to discover as well. And also provide a common documentation sort of like construct that allowed people to sort of view different things. All right. So before I even go any further, I should mention the architecture. So there's kind of like three key components: the core, which is really the base functionality that exists within Backstage, and we might sort of go somewhere close to looking at that, although not in a huge amount of detail. The actual GUI, the actual, I guess, the app instance itself, which is what you see. And this kind of ties together what you see on the left, which is the core, and also, I guess, the plugins as well. Like so, and then the ability to create more and more and see what happens. And then the plugins, and this is really a really powerful aspect of what it is. I think when they open sourced it, there was a bunch of plugins. I know from talking and seeing from other people, there's in excess of 100 plugins now. There's like so many plugins just because it's just grown and more people have. We'll have a look at that, and we'll try and have a look at that and see how we go. All right, we're going to do a demo, which is always fun. So that was a screenshot. Oh, I've just gone straight to GKE. So this is a version of Backstage, and I should have mentioned it, in fact, which I'm going to talk about actually a little bit later, but VMware actually is a major contributor to Backstage. So we are a major contributor, and actually the application platform, Tanzu application platform, which you're seeing right now, is an implementation of Backstage. The thing that VMware does over the top of that is provide you with a number of other plugins, a number of application starters. So there's a lot of value add that we put on top of Backstage to really kickstart your journey, so that you're not just dealing with the open source version, but also you've got the collective knowledge that VMware has. So we're going to look at that, and this is the implementation. But if you look at Backstage, it's pretty similar. So this is application platform, as I said, the graphical interface, and there's a couple of areas that we could look at. Oh, and the other thing I should mention, so without forgetting, this is deployed on Google Cloud. right? So there is the Google Cloud Platform, which it's deployed on. There is another view which I like looking at, which actually shows me the Google Cloud Platform that you can see there, CPU, memory, pods. And if I wanted to, I could actually show you a lot of the things that are deployed in Backstage. So example, here are a lot of the, well, not, these are all of the workloads that are deployed as part of Backstage, and they're all deployed on the Google Cloud Platform. So you can see them there. But I won't spend too much time here. This is just to give you the a view of what is deployed. Okay. And we're going to go back now to there, and then I'll go back to Tanzu Application Platform. So I mentioned application starters. I think I use that term. We actually call them accelerators, okay? And the beauty of the application, the accelerator, is this ability to be able to create this tile-like interface for a developer to be able to go and say, you know what, I need to go and create a Java app today, right? So, oh, I found the Java starter app. Let me go and click on that. Sorry, the Java accelerator. And so they can choose that. And I'll show you what happens there. They could additionally look at, you know, maybe I need to do a Python app. I'll click on the Python app. I'll need to do the Node app, whatever it is, right? They choose that. The beauty of this, as I mentioned before, pluggable architecture, you can, in your own organizations, in your own implementation, you can add to these accelerators. You can remove from these accelerators. You can also organizationally structure your accelerators. I have a team of people that only ever do .NET. You know what? I'll give them access to all of the accelerators that are .NET related. You can even go even further. What if it's just .NET API stuff? Like, well, you know what? I'll give them a specific accelerator that's just for them, and maybe the .NET other stuff is somewhere. But whatever it is, that's a really important sort of thing from an organizational perspective, because you can really streamline the approach that you've got. So that's a really powerful thing. You can add, remove, do whatever you and configure it whichever way you want. Let's dive into one of these. I think I was going to look at the which one was it? Ah, there it is, the Java one. Sorry. Yeah. So when you choose an accelerator to look at, and I'm wondering if you can all see that clearly. So I might increase that a little bit just to there, so you've got a bit of a view for it. You can see here, it's got the definition. I can change the name. I can, you know, specify where it's the image repository for it, whatever it is, doesn't matter. I then click on next. I'm just going to follow the defaults here, and then I can generate this accelerator. Now, what that's doing is effectively creating the key elements that are required for me to start developing against this project, I've called it project, really quickly. And it's automatically embedded a lot of the rules, call them rules for now, that are required to actually deploy this very quickly. So let me have a look at those. I'm not going to download it locally, but I'll just do an explore. So here is all of the elements that it's created. You can see, if anyone that knows Java, and I'm assuming that some of you do, some of you might not, but there's a whole bunch of things here. There's Maven from a packaging perspective. If I need to package, it's already there. There's some config in there, there's a POM file in there, but there's some really interesting stuff in here, which is around the config area, this thing called the workload YAML, right? In there, you will note that it's already defined the actual, a thing that you can see there that I'm highlighting, which is called Tanzu Java Web App, okay? Now, I'm going to show you what that actually looks like, but that effectively, it's injected a process, which I'll call a supply chain, because that's what I'm going to refer to it later, which is actually embedded as part of this accelerator, so that when I run or when I deploy this software into my repo, into my source location, let's say Git, right? This knows through this workload YAML that it should execute this particular supply chain, which will go through a number of process steps to get it into the environment that it needs to do. So it's already embedded in there. And so think about that. You go and create an accelerator for your particular team, for that particular project. You actually bind it to a supply chain, which is defined, has all of the steps that you need. And then when they go and create their accelerators, a dev team, they basically launch it, it automatically binds. It removes all of the YAML that I may have had to have written before, just limits it to effectively this amount of YAML, and everything else is created for you. And then away you go, right? And this utilizes a number of like technologies, which are all open source as well. You notice that it says the API version is Kato there. It's specific to that. So let me show you what that supply chain looks like. I should have said before that if there are any questions to actually put them in the chat, by the way, as well. So, but yeah, that's cool. So let me look at some supply chains. There is only one in this particular environment. It's a demo environment. This is the supply chain that we just saw, right? And so if you look at this supply chain, and I'll try and bring it up a bit bigger, you can see the elements of the supply chain which have been defined. So that application accelerator binds to this particular supply chain. There's a bunch of stuff in here. So beginning with, let's look at a Git repository from a source perspective. So whatever this app is that I've created via that accelerator is going into a Git repository. Therefore, it looks for that source repository. Then it does an image build. So it grabs the code and builds the image. Does some stuff from a configuration perspective based on the provider, does some app config, and then it writes some stuff. And then there's this beautiful step that exists in this supply chain, which is around an approval step. So rather than just automatically pushing this into whatever end environment I've got, there's a step in there which is around someone actually, marking something for deployment. Yes, this can be approved. This can be sort of deployed. And so that's I suppose a manual step in the process. And as that happens, when that happens, then there's a configuration pull. So it does some stuff. And then finally it delivers the image, effectively, the one that it's created, the image that's been built, and away you go. These supply chains, much like the accelerators, completely pluggable. Go and create your own. If you're using a particular build tool, you can plug that into here. If you're using a particular scanning, I don't think in this supply chain we're doing any scanning of the artifacts at all, but it's possible, of course. If you're using a scanning tool, you can plug it in. It's actually built for engineers to do that. But again, that's probably a separate topic which we could go into. Before I break from this particular demo, though, one of the things that I did discuss earlier, and I think is really important to discuss, is the API discoverability, registration discoverability. So here's a really, this is something that they created as part of it. And as I said before, because again, this is very flexible, very extendable, you can actually add more and more to this interface as and when you want. But in the API area, you can register an API, you can have a look at the APIs, you can limit who sees APIs, similarly to what you do with accelerators. So if I look at a particular API, I'm going to look at this one here. Okay, I'll look at this one, yeah. You can see. So some things that are really, really good here. I've got an overview of the API. There's a bit of a description in there. If I wanted to look at the technical docs, they would be there. They're all all in the single place. I can actually have a look at the API itself. It tells me like providers, consumers might be like. There might be some links to the actual, various things. The other thing that's really good is the API definition. So, if you wanted to have a look at the API definition, you can have a look at like what posts there are, what gets there are. You can potentially, if you want to do it, if you want to check something, you can check it. You can, try different things out if you want to try them out. This is super powerful from a perspective of a developer who wants to like, oh, hang on, this particular API looks like it could be something that I want to use. By looking at the definition, I can then determine what I need to do. You can even go further and I think as well in here somewhere, it has the owner of the particular API. So you can actually then interact with the owner if you needed to, if you haven't got enough information on, in this interface. But it's a very sort of powerful way of being able to sort of like discover APIs, then utilize them in your own development. And so this is kind of a vision of as I said, Tanzu application platform and implementation of Backstage, but sort of shows you all of those things. Very, very important. I should stop for a second and see if there's any questions. Are there any questions?
So I just want to understand that. Let's say that this is an implementation of Backstage, right? Because Backstage is open source, like what's the extent of advantages to choose tap over?
Well, two big ones. Yeah, well, that's a third one. I wasn't even thinking about that, but two big ones is the number of plugins that we've already developed and provide on top of that. And then also supply chains. So we've created a number of supply chains. But actually, when I say plugins, I should mention, separation, supply chain, which is also plugin, but also application accelerators as well. So the implementation of those and really simplifying the whole operational experience that you might have in the back end as well. Yeah.
To add to what David's saying, I mean, TAP is a complete application platform, wherein it also gives you the ability to have your developers get into a single portal, and that's where we have implemented Backstage in such a way that it becomes a single developer portal for all your developers within your organization that can help improve developer experience, and sort of they can get to have a single view of the whole ecosystem in a lot of ways.
Yeah, actually, and I should mention, thanks, Bridget. There's also an element of this which is around, I guess, architecturally your deployment of TAP as well, which I'm not getting into right here, but there's various mechanisms or various paradigms that you might want to follow in the way you deploy. Example, I might want to have a TAP or Backstage TAP deployment, which is just doing build. So there's no UI, it's just catering for build. And then I'll have a different TAP deployment, which is related to the build that just takes care of the deploy. And then I may have another deployment, which is view. Like there's all these different ways that you, and by the way, there's various ways that you could do that. But architecturally, that's kind of like a consideration. And one of the things that we do is like sit down with, I guess, an organization and think about their organizational structure, their security concerns, the way workloads are, development teams and how they want to interact, and then determine the best fit on how that should happen, right? So that's kind of like a little bit of a, a bit more of a thing as well. No, that's fine. Any other questions?
Nothing for now on chat.
Okay, no worries. So I guess, yes, remembering these modern app challenges is, I guess, just to sort of come back to those a little bit. And that's effectively what I just showed you, or the snippet of what I showed you. There's a lot more that you could look at. This is what Tanzu application platform is about. And so, starting really quickly, being able to iterate really quickly in terms of how you get your software going, and then also being able to collaborate across teams and much wider. And then then choreography of your path to production. How do you do the tests and build? How do you secure things and scan things? The supply chain I showed you didn't have the scanning part. We can have a look at a different version of that at a later date. How does it deploy? And then obviously it's going to run at some point as well. So really in summary around TAP, what have we got now? We've got this separation of concerns between the app developer, the application operations team, I guess, and a little bit of the platform ops side of things in terms of what they're delivering. Definitely is looking at this whole idea of shifting as much of the, like example, security left as possible. So you're not doing it as a post event, you're doing it as early in the cycle as possible. So yeah, removing that burden from the developer effectively. Building in the security elements, hopefully with some best practice automatically applied because you're able to define supply chains. Getting some parity between, from a development perspective, and then also that repeatability as well. And then obviously extensions. So the ability that you can create starters, you can create your own supply chains, you can do whatever you want. And actually, I should have shown you that the supply chains we created, but I'd have to get into a CLI command of kubectl, and I don't think anyone wants to have a look at that right now. So, so in terms of what we're providing, like we've got a lot of things from Backstage with TAP, some elements of build service. I won't spend too much time in this, the API discovery, but there's a lot of other things that we provide operationally to organizations to help with that as well. So thank you very much. I'll open to questions. Any questions? Good to go. There's no question. Oh, hang on.
Don't think so. We have any questions
Okay.
for now.
Well, thank you for having me. And if anyone does have any questions, oh, hang on, there is a question. What's the question?
Is governance and auditing included, or is it available?
It's a good question. That is a good question. It's,
So,
there's a level of, I guess, audit. Governance, I suppose, is a different discussion point,
Yeah.
really.
Actually,
you probably know.
so auditing is enabled in the system. So any actions which are taken within the system, as in terms of running a build pipeline or running the supply chain, are all audited. And the system has something called as a metadata store, wherein, for example, if you're running a security scan, the outputs of the security scan will be stored in the system. So that's part of auditing any actions that happen within the system. From a governance perspective, it's how you set up the system. So, for example, David did show to you about approvals, part of the supply chain. So that's one aspect of governance, wherein something can only be approved, for example, if there are only medium CVEs, as an example, within your within the artifact that you're generated. So there is governance also incorporated, but that governance is extremely customizable, and it's dependent on each and every organization and how they want to set it up. So the system is much more open-ended in terms of not only setting up the application platform and providing you auditability, but also providing you powerful options to customize how you include governance into the system. So both these factors are included.
And the interesting thing is governance. So yeah, the auditing one is correct, obviously correct, but the governance one, it's such a broad topic because there's different levels of governance, right? So it's funny because I was actually talking to someone earlier today about governance, and yeah, but I suppose the beauty of what you get out of TAP and Backstage is really like the fact that that extendability aspect. So you can build as much as you want. There's nothing stopping you from building in as many of the rules, policies, whatever you want within your supply chains as possible, as Pradeep mentioned. But it's governance is such a broad topic. There's so much to it.
And governance in a lot of ways also dependent on the sort of functionality that you're providing from within your applications. For example, financial industries have a lot more stronger governance aspects than maybe something like a hospitality based organization, right? So governance is extremely customizable, but it's also included within the platform.
Yep.
Thanks for the question, Stuart.
Yeah, that was a good question. Any others?
Okay, I don't think there are any more questions.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, David. It was really empowering understanding about application platforms and understanding how Backstage provides necessary bones in a lot of ways to build an application platform. It is also great to know and understand more about TAP, Tanzu application platform, and its implementation of Backstage. Thanks again, and for all the participants and people who joined in, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. As usual, I'll be uploading the video onto the YouTube channel on Monday, and we'll also have a slide deck shared. Please feel free to ask questions on the meetups, on the meetup comments whenever you want to, and we will definitely get back to you. Again, thanks for joining, and as always, a pleasure talking to you all. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.